What is happening, everybody? This is Mr. Cummings doing the APUSH Period review for Period 3 for the upcoming AP exam. We'll cover the American Revolution, early presidencies, all of the good early American stuff that I know you're just absolutely dying to get your hands on. So let's get it, let's go. So we'll start with some Period 3 context, kind of give you guys a little bit of background about what's going on into Period 3. Period 3 begins in 1754 with the beginning of the French and Indian War. However, there is a ton of stuff that has occurred for the colonial period leading up to this point. The big takeaways that we need to be aware of, things that will influence the coming American Revolution, which is the big chunk of this period, are the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. So the Enlightenment, rough to kind of get a time period on, but you're looking at late 1600s to around 1800-ish. Different historians date it different time periods, but it's kind of that 100-year chunk. It's an intellectual movement focusing on the individual, rational thought, rejecting of the old school European monarchies, things, power of the church, right? Much more based on science, reasoning, things like that. Paves the way for political revolutions, which are coming, specifically the American Revolution, the French Revolution, things like that. Notable influential people we need to be aware of: John Locke. Jefferson borrows heavily from him on life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. John Locke, life, liberty, ownership of property. Voltaire, Rousseau, all of these guys will very much influence the creation of the American government and our fundamental foundational identity principles. The Great Awakening happens in part as a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is all about ration and reason, so not really a lot about faith and church. So it in the colonies is you're looking at 1730s to about 1740. Bunch of church revivals sweep through England, comes over to the colonies as well, seeking to renew individual piety, religious devotion. What this ends up being is a shared colonial experience. We're not going to go into too much detail for you on this particular video about the old lights and the new lights and all that other stuff. But ultimately what the Great Awakening does is it highlights how the individual can change church structure. You got guys like Jonathan Edwards up in modern day New England doing "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" as his sermon. George Whitefield coming over from Europe, traveling around, goes from Georgia up to New England, unifies the colonies with this religious fervor. And what we get out of the Great Awakening is this concept that we're changing our church structure, our changing our order, we're changing the very relationship with God. So if we can do that, what else can we change? And then you couple that with the Enlightenment and this emphasis on the individual, personal liberty, natural rights that exist not from a government but from God. And you begin to see how this will lay a foundation for a radical change of thought leading into the American Revolution. So what do we need to know about the French and Indian War? Well, not a lot, honestly. It's a conflict between England and her Native American allies against France and their Native American allies. Will be fought in the colonies in modern day North America, United States colonies, stuff like that, as well as blowing up into a larger global conflict as well. But we don't really need to be focused on that. Largely, the battles and all that can be fought up in the North Great Lake region, really fighting over kind of the Ohio River Valley is the part of the country we're talking about. Ultimately, what we need to know out of this is England wins, but it comes at a high cost. This war puts England in pretty serious debt. They need to pay that debt off, and that's going to set up all of the taxation, which we'll look at here in a second. Big takeaway from this: 1763, two things happen. Salutary neglect comes to an end. Make sure we know what salutary neglect is: the old school attitude that England had of kind of letting the colonies be somewhat self-sufficient, not really enforcing the Navigation Acts to 100% efficiency. And this allowed for this kind of self-identity to form over time in the colonies. So when that comes to an end, the colonies and the people living there are going to be pretty upset. As well as in 1763 is the Proclamation Line. You see a picture of it there. They use the Appalachian Mountains, and they basically say, don't settle west of this line. Why does England do this? In part because Pontiac's Rebellion had taken place and is taking place continuously into 1764. It's an alliance of Native American tribes out in the Great Lakes region, things like that. They fight the soldiers after the French and Indian War. Very costly, and what England realizes is they don't want this flood of colonial immigration into this new territory and have it be haphazard and not have it be systematic, and you spark an Indian fight in Ohio, you spark another one in Tennessee, whatever, and England has to put out all these fires all at one time. That cost a lot of money to keep their army out there, etc. And this really becomes, the proclamation line really becomes the first point of real contention or disagreement between the 13 colonies in British North America and England and Parliament and the Crown back home. That they thought, the colonists thought, we fought this war in order to get Ohio, kick the French off the continent, and we then can take all of this great farmland in Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, places like that, and we'll flood in there and take it. England has other ideas, and that creates a point of conflict for the colonies. As we go through this journey through period 3, in the back of your head, I want you to be keeping track of these events on how a unique American identity can be created and when does it get created. You're not going to get a revolution and a declaration of independence until you have this idea that we here in the colonies, we are just different. We're a different set of people than what is in England. We're no longer British. So that journey could be a part of an essay question for you guys, or anything like that. So just keep that in the back of your head as we go forward. So England's going to ultimately attempt to reassert control over the North American colonies. They're going to reinforce the Navigation Acts. Remember, the Navigation Acts were laws meant to enforce mercantilistic policies. This is the period of mercantilism, the idea that you have mother countries establishing overseas colonies for the express purpose of extracting raw materials to be shipped back to the mother country, transformed into manufactured products, and then sent out all over the empire. So you don't want your colonies trading with foreign powers, etc. This is all meant to enrich the mother country. The Navigation Acts were originally meant to enforce that. They weren't strictly enforced over the last 100 years as part of salutary neglect. But now England's going to try to start locking those down. They're going to increase taxation as well, create new taxes for the colonies as an effort to pay for the war and the increased presence of the soldiers, because that's the only thing standing between them and the Indians. So you get things like the Grenville Reforms, Townshend Acts, etc. Colonists are going to resist this in a variety of ways. Political discourse, you'll ultimately have guys like John Dickinson writing the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, arguing about what Parliament can and cannot tax. They'll smuggle stuff. They'll just blatantly break the law. And you'll ultimately end up also having things like mob violence. The guys like the Sons of Liberty with Samuel Adams, ultimately responsible for the Tea Party example, doing violence against tax collectors as well. And this will bring in this idea of taxation without representation and the chant, no taxation without representation. England will argue that by the colonies being part of the empire and Parliament representing the empire, therefore the colonies are, quote, virtually represented by Parliament. That's not going to fly with the colonists. They want an active voice. They want representatives from the colonies sitting in Parliament over in London to carry a voice for the colonies. In England's, that's not going to happen. The big taxes that we really need to worry about and be able to name drop in an essay and define and use them to further our point, definitely want to drop in the Stamp Act. This is the tax where you had to have the stamp on all the official documents, all that other stuff. The idea here is that it leads to the Stamp Act Congress. And why is that important? Is it's a step towards colonial unity that ultimately will get us to the idea of banding together to form our own country and declare independence. So the Stamp Act Congress forms with the express purpose of repealing the Stamp Act. It's not very creatively named. It is successful. England will pull back the Stamp Act, and this is where they leave on the Declaratory Act saying, hey, look, we can tax you whenever we want, we're superior, etc., just to kind of sharp stick them on their way out the door. But the Stamp Act does get repealed, so what does this show the colonists? Hey, we can form an organization, we can band together, we can bring Massachusetts and South Carolina into the same room and put aside differences and pursue a common goal. So it does strengthen that identity. Later on, England will drop the Tea Act. They're British, it's tea. This leads to the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty dressing up as Native Americans, running out there, throwing all the tea into the harbor. And then in response to that, England will pass what are in England are called the Coercive Acts, and here in the colonies will be called the Intolerable Acts. Specifically, they do 4 big things. Number 1, they're going to close the port of Boston. That's a big deal. Boston's a merchant city. They need shipping. They will strip Massachusetts of its government, so their representative local government in Boston goes away. Those are the 2 big ones, because what this then also shows is that if they can do that, and they being England, if they can do that in Boston, they can do it in Charleston. They can do it in Baltimore. They can do it in other colonies, and it begins to show the colonists this kind of wake up moment of we're all kind of in this together. So the coercive acts, intolerable acts, the names are pretty much interchangeable for y'all's purposes. They'll also take away the courts. You got to go have a trial in England, all kinds of crazy stuff. But the two big ones, again, closes the ports, strangling them economically, and takes away their representative government. Remember, these guys have been guaranteed the rights of Englishmen from the inception, from Jamestown in 1607. And so this is seen to be violating those rights of Englishmen. The Boston Massacre has also occurred during this time period. You have soldiers there as part of the Quartering Act, which requires the citizens to house and feed and pay for the soldiers' cost of living themselves. You have them marching around Boston. Boston crowd eggs them on. You get into kind of a shooting thing. You can see on the left there Paul Revere's very propagandized version of the Boston Massacre. But this very much highlights an us versus them mentality. The people in Boston are beginning to see the soldiers as an occupying force. They've been recalled from the frontier by this point to being a majority of the cities. Those numbers will continue to grow up until the time of the Revolution. And you don't really shoot your own people is kind of the attitude there. So this is a big divide between the two. And then out of the Stamp Act Congress, things like that, you'll begin to see Continental Congresses form. The first Continental Congress is in 1774 and is done in response to the Intolerable Acts. Massachusetts is going to be said to be in rebellion, and the soldiers are going to be shipped in. So the whole idea here is they're going to petition the king out of the First Continental Congress, and they're going to agree on boycotts. They're going to recognize their economic power. This will prominently feature women as everybody gets together to have knitting parties and everything. So you get a social element of this as well, looking at how women are involved in this process. The Second Continental Congress forms after Lexington and Concord because as the British soldiers move in to take away the guns, the Minutemen show up, fire on the British soldiers, which we'll get to here in a second. And so the Second Continental Congress ends up being the governing body of the colonies during the war, operating under the Articles of Confederation, which we'll touch on a little later. So you begin to see more and more colonial unity increasing as we get closer and closer to that famous date of 1776. So we have the battles of Lexington and Concord. This pretty much puts us at a shooting war with England, even without a declaration. You have the soldiers moving to the militia stores where they keep the gunpowder and the weapons and stuff like that. Minutemen respond like we touched on in the previous slide. And then bang, the famous shot heard around the world. We still have contentious debates surrounding independence in the Continental Congress. Ultimately, they'll do a last Hail Mary heave with something called the Olive Branch Petition, send it right to the king. It's not going to work. Declaration of Independence is voted on. Will be authored by T.J., Ben Franklin, John Adams, and some other guys, but those are the three heavy hitters, Jefferson being the most influential on this document. Very influential document throughout history, not only for our own history, but the world's. Chock full of Enlightenment ideas right from the very beginning. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We get that from John Locke. And then the rest of it is the list of grievances. And it's really meant for our own people in the world. England knows we're trying to declare independence because we're shooting their soldiers. So this is really meant as kind of a document to justify what we're doing. And Jefferson writes about that very eloquently throughout the document. So what do we need to know about the American Revolution? Again, not a military history class, so we're not going to go over all the in-depth battles and all of that stuff. Ultimately, hopefully you know that the United States does win the American Revolution. We do get some help with the French. 1775, County Lexington and Concord, 1783, Treaty of Paris. Two things we need to know, really. Battle of Saratoga is the turning point. It proves, that victory proves, hey, we might have a chance to win this war, which will encourage the French to come in and put us over the top. And then the Battle of Yorktown is where Cornwallis surrenders to Washington, kind of last big battle of the war. Largely fought by the average citizen, very elite ideas. So you've got TJ writing the Declaration and all these Enlightenment ideas, and then that filtering down to your average small farm owner and stuff like that. They want the land and the opportunities in the West and the debt issues, all kinds of things are factored into that. But largely fought by the average citizen. Women will help. They will be very important for the economy during the war. They keep the economy running in a way. Everybody goes to the people who are going to go fight. Those farms will be empty. Right? Won't have men at home, so women have to keep the farms running, rearing children. You'll have Abigail Adams remember the women, which we'll touch on here and stuff. So very important contribution from women. Slavery aspects also factor into this. The British are trying to actively recruit slaves away from southern plantations with the Phillipsburg Proclamation, Dunmore's Proclamation. Even the American government says, if you fight for us, we'll free you, and some actually do. So there's an impact on the slavery experience as well. And then Washington is kind of a critical figure. Hopefully we know that. He leads the army, the Continental Army he's put in charge, and he is instrumental in keeping the revolution going. He's not the best tactician commander, the X's and O's of how to fight, but he's brilliant at keeping his army intact and keeping them as a fighting force. So as long as there's Washington, and as long as he has an army, there's a revolution. England will take all the cities. They'll occupy New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They'll run the Continental Congress out of there. But as long as Washington has that army, it's representative of the revolution. They can't ever get them. England is hampered by a long supply chain. They have to get orders and information across the Atlantic, more supplies from the empire, either across the Atlantic, up from the Caribbean. They have global empire concerns. They can't pull all the resources out of the Caribbean to go fight on the mainland because France, Spain could take their Caribbean possessions. And remember, the sugar islands down in the Caribbean, the West Indies, are far more profitable than the mainland colonies. So England has to keep those concerns in the back of their head as well. And then they're fighting on the colonists' home turf. Right? England is fighting to put down a rebellion. Right? In English schools, it's taught as the war of insurrection, right? From their perspective. We're fighting for our livelihood. We're fighting for our homes, our family, our future. We're fighting on our territory, which gives us tactical and strategic advantages as well. And then you throw in the French alliance. They bring the Navy in to help us out, and ultimately get the Treaty of Paris, 1783, concludes the war, ensures American independence. So what's the impact? Long term, right, we get rid of nobility and primogeniture. So primogeniture was the inheritance to the firstborn. We knock out that aristocratic class, and we will replace them, at least in the northern colonies, with a merchant class. We move towards greater separation of church and state. The Anglican Church is reduced in power, especially in southern states. And then we'll tack on, right, the First Amendment. We already have the Maryland Act of Religious Tolerance, etc. Women, we touched on a little bit, massive impact on the success of the war. But ladies, you're going to end up staying second-class citizens. The new America is not going to include opportunities of freedom and citizenship for women, slaves, natives, and stuff like that. Abigail Adams extolling her husband, John Adams, to remember the women. And then John gets down to draft the new government, and he's like, man, I forgot something. Sorry about that, ladies. Slavery, there is a chance to abolish it. A lot of northern states already have at this point. They'll ban the importation of foreign slaves, but ultimately in the drafting of the Constitution, they kick that can down the road too. And then for Native Americans, this represents kind of a major beginning of the end moment for their way of life on the North American continent. It's going to take a while. The Americans won't knock out Indian resistance until the late 1800s at Wounded Knee, but England's going to bail, and they're going to honor treaties or protect them or anything. They're going to roll out, and then we're going to quickly move in and start moving them further and further west. We'll get Battle of Fallen Timbers, Battle of Tippecanoe, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, the reservation systems, and then once we discover gold out west, that's going to accelerate the process. So these minority classes or unprotected classes as we transition into the United States of America don't see a lot of change from English rule to American rule. But you can also make the counter argument that it's the system of government that is created that will ultimately allow for the positive changes that take place over the next, to the present day time period, right? We're still having battles and debates over equality and things like that. So just keep that in the back of your head as well. How does the revolution impact different groups? College Board loves to ask about social questions like that. And so if we get a question like that, we'll be able to knock it out of the park. So it's all fine and good that you've won the war. Big accomplishment. Good job, America. But now we have to have a system of government. We've been operating under something called the Articles of Confederation. And what I need you to get out of that ultimately and immediately, these are not a good way of having a government. The articles aren't. They're weak at the federal level. Hopefully you can understand that. We're fighting a war against perceived tyranny and a monarchy. So the last thing we want to do is turn around and create that here in our new country. States have almost all the power in the articles system. There's no executive, so there's no president. That could be a king potentially. No Supreme Court. It's just a one house legislature where one state has one vote. Requires unanimous approval to make changes. So all 13 have to agree to it. And the big one there in bold, they cannot tax and they cannot regulate trade, which means they cannot generate revenue. So you can't pay for an army, you can't pay for a navy, you can't pay for anything if you don't have any money. The only good thing that occurs from this, the Articles of Confederation, is, I guess, two. We do win independence under it, but is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This establishes the Northwest Territory, which is going to be the modern states of Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, kind of around the Great Lakes region. It will prohibit slavery. It will fund public education through land sales out there, and also establishes the pattern we'll use to add future states. Once you get so many people, you can get a state legislature. Once you get even more people, you can write a constitution and apply for statehood, is the big takeaway. And we'll use that all the way through for the most part. So this could fall under westward expansion type essays. This is kind of the first big chunk. Then you'd go to the Louisiana Purchase and stuff like that, and then off to the races from there. It could fall into a slavery debate throughout, like a continuity and change over time. It's an example of limiting slavery in the country. It sets up Dred Scott's decision later on. But ultimately, the Articles of Confederation are really weak. Your go-to example for that, to highlight that weakness, would be something called Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays is a Revolutionary War vet up in Massachusetts, being crushed by the debt because, again, the war was expensive. The economy's in shambles at the end of the war. Gets his boys together. They're going to march on different institutions in Massachusetts, and nobody can stop it. The federal government can't, because you got to get state permission, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a fear that this could spill out into the other states, et cetera. Ultimately, it doesn't. But it does highlight the weakness, that and then the debt issues highlight the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. They're going to get together. They have the Annapolis Convention first, and then ultimately the Constitutional Convention, where they will draft the Constitution. James Madison and company will get together and draft the Constitution. It's meant to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. You have a debate between the Federalists, who would favor the Constitution and a stronger central government. It is what the Constitution creates, a much stronger central government. And then what you will call the Anti-Federalists, kind of the first two factions in America, who are against it, are fearful it's a pathway to tyranny. You have several debates in the Constitution as well. The Federalist Papers are written basically to convince people, hey, this is a good thing. So you could see those as a document on the DBQ. That's what it's referring to, arguing that a strong central government actually can protect individual rights better, things like that. You have the New Jersey and Virginia plans. This is how do we structure the government. New Jersey wants one state, one vote. That protects smaller states. Virginia wants representation based on population. Of course they do. They're the most populous state. You'll get the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, where they're like, hey, let's just take both ideas and smash them together. You create the House of Representatives based on representation, and the Senate, 2 senators from each state. Each state has an equal vote. You'll have the 3/5 Compromise as well. This deals with how do you count and apportion slaves. The Southerners wanted them counted straight up as people, because then that increases their representation. Northerners didn't want them counted because they were slaves. They wanted them to be free, and they settle on the 3/5 Compromise. The Federalist system that is created through the Constitution, this idea that you have federal government, state government, local government. They have exclusive powers, meaning that there are only certain things each level can do. In the modern version of this, so the states have an educational system. Each state's educational system is different. There is not a federally mandated curriculum. The federal government is the only one that can coin money. So Texas can't be printing their own money or anything like that. And then they also have what are called concurrent powers. These are powers shared by the two. So there's a Texas court system. There is a federal court system. And they kind of work hand in hand on that. The anti-federalists are concerned about individual rights, so ultimately they do get what's called the Bill of Rights. These are your first 10 amendments, make sure you know them. Not only for your test, but because you live here, and it's kind of important knowing your individual protections and civil liberties. So First Amendment, Second, all that, just make sure we know them all. They're good name drops, and they're just good to know. And the Constitution is still working. So 1787 to right now. So that's a pretty good document. Washington is going to get elected the first president under the Constitution. Kind of a no-brainer. The only dude in history of the United States to be elected unanimously, receiving every electoral college vote possible. Speaking of the electoral college, it does establish that as well. So it's not just a popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes, it's the electoral college votes. And then how do we highlight the success of the articles in comparison to the article, or excuse me, the success of the Constitution in comparison to the articles? The Whiskey Rebellion, which we'll touch on under Washington's presidency. So if you're writing about the articles, you want to say they're weak. Why are they weak? Biddity boppity boop. The bullet points there. Tack on the Shays Rebellion. And then for the Constitution, it's pretty much the exact opposite of the articles. They can tax. They can regulate trade, interstate commerce clause, the elastic clause that's in there, necessary and proper, all these different things about the Constitution that we should know. And then the Whiskey Rebellion is the immediate example that you can use to highlight its success. So we mentioned George Washington is the first president. No-brainer decision. He's kind of the man in a variety of ways. Tall dude, tall people make great presidents. He's a commanding presence in the room. He is the commander of the army that won the revolution. His resume is pretty good. So he is going to be responsible to fill out the kind of the first government, right? He's going to set a lot of precedents for us. So he's elected 1788, will take office 1789, and we'll do the 2 terms going to the election of 1796. So he's going to establish the executive branch. He's going to create 4 kind of departments. The State Department, run by Thomas Jefferson. Treasury Department, run by Alexander Hamilton. You can see the other 2. Those are the 2 we really need to be worried about. State Department, Treasury, those are some heavy-hitting names. His vice president is John Adams. So look at that all-star collection of talent Washington has, right? He's president. John Adams is vice president. TJ is Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. Ben Franklin is still bumping around as well. So a lot of heavy-hitting names involved in the first government. Congress is responsible for creating the Supreme Court and the federal court system. They do that with the Judiciary Acts. And then Hambone over here, he's going to look at some finances because the country's finances are pretty bad. He's going to focus on 3 major things: debts, manufacturing, and creation of a bank. So debts is a huge issue. It's one of the reasons we went to the Constitution. So Hamilton will argue successfully that the states, the federal government will assume or take on the state debt as part of the national debt, and then work to pay that off to a certain degree as quickly as possible. He'll favor high tariffs. Tariffs are a big thing in this part of history. They're a tax on imported goods. So not only is it a revenue source, but it also protects early American manufacturing. We'll get way in depth in that in period 4 when we get into things like the market revolution, etc. And then he also wants to create a bank for depositing government funds, printing currency, stabilizing the American economy. This thing sets off, Hamilton and his ideas, sets off kind of the first big political divide in the country. Hamilton is a Federalist. I got a chart in a future slide here in a second, so you can look at this pretty easily. And then Jefferson is going to lead kind of the opposition, the anti-Federalists, and then later what's called the Democratic Republicans. The bank, for example, you can use this to highlight this debate, is over what's called strict or loose interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton's a loose interpretation guy. So he's going to read the Constitution, and when Jefferson says, hey, you can't create a bank, the Constitution doesn't allow it, Hamilton's going to say, well, where does it say I can't? So he's going to say that if it doesn't expressly prohibit me, then the assumption is that I can do it. Jefferson is the exact opposite. If it doesn't expressly allow him to do it, then the assumption should be that you can't. Jefferson's going to lose this argument. With Hamilton, the bank will get created. This then sets up some conflicts with guys like Andrew Jackson in the future. But yeah, so that's the first kind of big divide, Federalist, anti-Federalist. We saw it a little bit already with debates around the Constitution itself and then the Bill of Rights. That will continue in. Washington is not really associated with this. He's a non-party president. And then the first 2 political parties that form in the country will be the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. So Washington has a lot to do. We just because we've won the war against England doesn't mean we're not vulnerable. Doesn't mean we aren't trying to be our own country as strong as we can be. So Washington's going to favor neutrality. He doesn't want to pick sides. That's a good way to get drawn into a war. So you have the French Revolution going on. We have treaties with France saying, hey, we'll help you, you helped us scenario. And they're saying, hey, come over here and help us. And Washington's like, nah, we're good. We're not getting involved in that. So his neutrality proclamation in 1793 becomes a bedrock foreign policy idea for the United States for the next almost 100 years. This idea that we don't get involved in other people's conflicts and other people's political affairs. We just like want to be able to do business with everybody and kind of have free trade, travel, etc. But we don't want to be in alliances or anything like that. He'll send John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty. There are some lingering issues from the Revolutionary War that the Treaty of Paris did not address. So Jay goes over there, bangs out a treaty with England. England agrees to evacuate the forts that they had in the western lands, so Ohio, Indiana, places like that. There's another issue Jay goes over to try to negotiate, which is what's called impressment. This idea that the English Navy is taking American shipping and sailors and be like, you're in the Navy now. Congratulations. Not really cool, harassing our ships on the open seas, stuff like that. England doesn't really say anything about that. So Jay comes back with Jay's treaty, and it doesn't address the issue of the sailing aspects, which will be a major cause in the War of 1812. Spain sees the deal with England, and they're like, oh, well, we don't want America getting real cozy with our big rival. So they bang out the Pinckney Treaty. The guy named Pinckney goes and does it. So this secures us navigation of the Mississippi. We can use New Orleans ports without fees, which is going to be really big for us, and then establishes a consistent border with Spanish Florida with the now United States. Washington on domestic side, not really going to be a friend to the Native Americans. We'll clear them out with the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This will open up western lands for settlement. Later on, in a future president, will knock out Tippecanoe as well. The Whiskey Rebellion occurs. Hamilton, as part of his revenue schemes, wanted to have an excise tax on whiskey. You have western guys that are making whiskey on the frontier, like, we're not paying that. So Washington, through the power of the Constitution and Congress, is able to federalize the militia and marches out. And this show of force creates the kind of a fear level for the whiskey guys. And they're like, you know what, we're good. Our bad. We'll pay your taxes. So it is able to put down a potential revolt in a way that the Articles of Confederation could not with Shays' Rebellion. And then Washington's farewell address could easily be a document on a DBQ. Two big takeaways that we need to get out of that is he warns against the creation of political parties, our bad, and then warns against creating entangling foreign alliances, which we're pretty good at for the 1800s, not so good at in the 20th and 21st century. And so who knew that Washington not only was a good general, but a good president, but also could know the future and try to warn America away from it. So as promised, here's your political parties chart. On the left, we have the Federalists. On the right, you have the Democratic Republicans. Some notable names that we need to know: John Adams, Alexander Hamilton are Federalists. Democratic Republicans, TJ and Madison. So again, very prominent, intelligent guys. TJ, author of the Declaration. Madison, kind of known as the father of the Constitution. Federalists will favor a strong federal government and loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans will be the exact opposite, favoring a more state-centric or state rights system and a more strict interpretation. Federalists will be pro-business, banks, and tariffs. Pro-British, big military, and strongest in the Northeast. The reason it's going to be in the Northeast is where's all the commercial centers of the young country. It's going to be in the Northeast. Business owners, large landowners, again, because you're making money off of that. Democrat Republicans, pro-French, small military. Pro-agriculture, Jefferson will have, and we'll get into it in period 4, but the yeoman republic, the idea that true independence comes from owning your own land and not being beholden to anybody. They will be strongest in the South, agrarian, very states' rights to that, even to this day. Western frontier, small farmers, your skilled workers, and your plantation owners are kind of the big support groups there. So we're creating a divide politically, ideologically, as well as geographically. Notice how on these two political parties, no one really is concerned about slavery. The abolition of slavery debate is present during this time period, but it is not the all-consuming debate that it becomes in the future. The first big, what we call the first American party system or first political system, is really focused more on ideas of constitutionality and state power versus federal power. Slavery increasingly becomes part of that debate as the federal state argument fades away. But early on, it is very much not concerned about slavery, nor being nice to Native Americans either. So Washington is out. He gives his farewell address. The other thing Washington does, in addition to warning away of parties and alliances, is he's also going to set that trend of 2 terms. It's not anywhere in the Constitution. The term limits don't exist there. Washington just does it. And that pattern will hold true until FDR. The whole idea is kind of like, if it was good enough for George Washington, it's good enough for me. FDR will break that trend in the 1930s and 40s by getting elected to 4 consecutive terms and then die in his 4th term, which will then usher in the 22nd Amendment, limiting the President of the United States to 2 terms, no more than 10 years. But Adams, he's going to win. Narrow election, wins by 3 electoral college votes. Jefferson ends up being his vice president. That's a little awkward. Go back to the previous slide. You have John Adams as a notable leader of the Federalists, Thomas Jefferson as a notable leader of the Democratic Republicans, and one's president, the other's vice president. And so that's slightly awkward. The 12th Amendment does address this in 1804, the idea that it's no longer going to be whoever gets the most electoral college votes is president, whoever gets the second most is vice president. They fixed that issue. Adams, not much we need to know about him for the purpose of our course. He has the XYZ affair. You do have French warships harassing American shipping. This is a trend. The British are doing it. The French are doing it. Adams will send a delegation to Paris to discuss this. There are 3 officials that are unnamed in the newspaper. So the newspaper lists them as official X, official Y, and official Z, using the variables there in place of their names. They basically want America to bribe them. Like, hey, you have to pay us just for the right to negotiate with our government. Obviously, the Americans are upset. That's not treating us like a legit free nation. You wouldn't do that to England, for example. So this creates a potential conflict between the United States and France, leads into what's called the quasi-war. It's not a full-on open declaration war, but cooler heads do prevail, even though you do have this pro-England, pro-France argument between the 2 parties. But ultimately, cooler heads prevail. We back off because our military is not prepared. Our finances aren't prepared. Send new ministers to France, but it is a foreign policy thing for Adams. The other big takeaway for Adams, probably the most important one we need to know for our purposes here, are the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists win both houses in 1798 in response in part to the French messing with us. They'll use this advantage to pass laws that restrict their political rivals, the Democratic Republicans. So the 3 acts, Naturalization, Alien, Sedition Acts, you can see the definitions there. Naturalization Act extends the time period to become a citizen, because immigrants have a tendency to be more Democratic Republican during this time period. The Alien Acts, POTUS is President of the United States. He could deport aliens considered dangerous, detain them during times of war. And the Sedition Act, probably the biggest one here, makes it illegal for newspapers to criticize the president or Congress, and imposed fines and prison times for those who did. This is a time period where the media is not saying they're unbiased. You have pro-Democratic Republican newspapers, pro-Federalist newspapers run by editors who are pro-political party guys. And if you're sitting there wondering, wow, this seems like a gross violation of the First Amendment, you would probably be correct. The only problem is this whole idea of deciding constitutionality is a question that has not been decided yet. The Supreme Court has not rendered their decision on Marbury v. Madison. That is the court case that provides them that power. So Jefferson and Madison write these documents that are passed and discussed in the state houses, known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And basically their argument is it's a compact, it's an agreement. The states voluntarily have joined the Union. Therefore, if the federal government of that union passes a law they don't agree with or deem to be unconstitutional, they can, quote, nullify it. So this becomes a big argument of the day on who has the right to declare a law unconstitutional, if that right even exists. It's not in the Constitution, right? So Jefferson is arguing that then it defaults back to the states, You can make a 9th and 10th Amendment argument along that path as well. And the Federalists are going to say, no, you can't do that. So this nullification idea kind of gets ingrained early on in American ideology, and we'll see it rise up again with South Carolina and the nullification crisis of the tariff, dealing with Andrew Jackson, the tariff of abominations in the 1830s, late 1820s, early 1830s. And you see it again in the run-up to the Civil War. Compromise of 1850 gives you a new Fugitive Slave Act. Northern states don't like it, and they'll pass personal liberty laws, which nullify the Fugitive Slave Act. So you see this issue come up again and again. The furor over this fades pretty quickly. Federalists are out in 1800, and then shortly after that, Marbury v. Madison's decision gets handed down, and the Supreme Court will take on the power of judicial review. But it does highlight early constitutional debates and rivalries within political parties. So you look at the election of 1800, known as the Peaceful Revolution or the Revolution of 1800. The Federalists are out. Not only is Adams out, but they're out of Congress as well. Jefferson will be ushered in as president. Jefferson and Aaron Burr actually tie. Neither of them gets a majority of the Electoral College. Therefore, it has to go to the House of Representatives. And the House, still run by the Federalists at this time, actually will pick Jefferson, because Hamilton steps in and says Jefferson as a man of higher moral character and represents less of a threat to the country than Aaron Burr does. We call it a revolution because it's a change of power, it's a change of ideological power, and it's peaceful. There isn't violence in the street, which is rare for this time period when you look at our revolution, the French Revolution, etc. The Federalists quietly accept defeat. Adams steps out, Jefferson steps in, and this would be another example of proving that the constitutional system works and can handle political stresses. There's enough flexibility, there's enough acceptance there that we can get different people elected with different ideas, and we don't need to be shooting one another in the streets. And that is a tradition that extends even to present day. The one exception to that would be Lincoln's election in 1860, where the South's like, we're out, they throw the deuce and go form their own country. But for the most part, peaceful transfers of power. This is not to say there aren't protests, that there aren't people who disagree with elections and don't like the results, but we're not fighting faction wars on the streets of America. That's what this is really highlighting, and that's why this election ends up kind of being so fundamentally important to early American history, as well as future traditions. So some other things to think about here. We touched on American identity already. You also have a trend in early American history of poor Western frontier people clashing and arguing and disagreeing with wealthy coastal elites. The axis of the country early, during the colonial period and then early American history, is as much east and west as it is north and south. The north-south divide, the sectionalism divide, crystallizes into the early 1800s, but you also have an east-west divide early on. So going all the way back to old school, right, period 2 time period, you have Bacon's Rebellion, poor farmers out on the frontier getting squeezed by the Indians against coastal elites. Shays' Rebellion again, poor farmers going against the elites. The Whiskey Rebellion, resisting the excise tax, coastal elites. Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, and then the Carolina Regulators. All of these together are examples to highlight the divide between poor frontier, wealthy East Coast. Potential essay topics that, just given some thought here, no guarantees. I wish I knew, but I don't. But you could see essays chronicling continuity and change over time of American identity, what it means to be American, etc. Rise and fall of political parties could be an essay topic that would include this period. Growing sectionalism, it's not a huge thing in, say, 1795, but as we move in to the 1800s, it becomes one. So this period could end up being context for you on that, on an essay question about the growing debates over slavery, because it's only, this period ends in 1800, and then it's 20 years to the Missouri Compromise, which is a big divide in the slave debate. Growing debates on slavery, on the idea of what we should and should not do with slavery. Westward expansion debates, Northwest Ordinance. Jefferson very quickly will do the Louisiana Purchase, which will double the size of the country. Yes, I understand that's period 4, but again, it can bleed across periods there. And these are just some potential ideas to be thinking about. in the back of our head. Period 4, we'll jump into a lot of economics. We'll have the market revolution, Henry Clay's American system, Andrew Jackson. Period 4 is a big one. Lots of stuff in there. So I appreciate it if you're still listening and if you hung on to the very end. Thank you for being here. Here is a nice little timeline for those of you who like things in order. So you can see starting with the French and Indian War in 1754 and ending with Jefferson's election in 1800. And then here's a nice colorful American picture for you. George Washington, early American flag. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to email me at any time. And good luck, and hopefully you are now a period 3 expert.